After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the functions and features of Finance Commission in India, learn about the terms of reference of various finance commissions, and understand the major recommendations of the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th Finance Commissions.
The Indian Constitution provides an institutional framework or body known as the Finance Commission to facilitate center state transfers. It came into existence in 1951 under Article 280 of the Indian Constitution, mainly to give its recommendations on the distribution of tax revenues between the Union and the states and amongst the states themselves. The Finance Commission is constituted every 5 years by the President of India. The Finance Commission defines the financial relations between the Union and the states and deals with devolution of non-planned revenue resources. It aims at redressing the vertical imbalances between the taxation powers and expenditure responsibilities of the centre and the states, respectively, and equalization of all public services across the states. Over the years, there has been considerable expansion in the role of the commissions from being an arbitrator between the centre and the states to being an architect of fiscal restructuring. This has brought near stability in the share of states in the combined revenue expenditure at about 57%. Moreover, centralization of economic policy did not show up in any reduction in the share of the states, though states' expenditure has come to be more influenced by the centre. There has been a marked decline in the revenue expenditure financed by own resources from nearly 80% in the 50s to around 60% now, partly on account of higher buoyancy of the central taxes and increase in their coverage. A finance commission is one of the most important constitutionally mandated economic bodies. Unlike the planning commission, which was set up by a government resolution in 1950 to push the economic agenda of the party in power, finance commissions draw their power directly from the constitution. Their recommendations, while not binding, are generally accepted. The government has to inform Parliament on what it plans to do about the Commission's recommendations. There are two important reasons for the constitution of finance commissions. Taxation rights favor the centre over states, even though the latter provide most of the services used by the people. Further, poorer states require additional help for rapid economic growth. Finance commissions are seen as institutional mechanisms for transferring resources from the centre to the states.
Let us start with the functions of Finance Commission. First, it is the duty or function of the Finance Commission to make recommendations to the President as to the distribution between the Union and the states of the net proceeds of taxes which are to be or may be divided between them and the allocation between the states of the respective shares of such proceeds. Second, the principles which should govern the grants in aid of the revenues of the states out of the Consolidated Fund of India. Third, the measures needed to augment the Consolidated Fund of a state to supplement the resources of the panchayats in the state on the basis of the recommendations made by the Finance Commission of the state. Fourth, the measures needed to augment the Consolidated Fund of a state to supplement the resources of the municipalities in the state on the basis of the recommendations made by the Finance Commission of the state. Fifth, any other matter referred to the Commission by the President in the interests of sound finance. The Commission determines its procedure and have such powers in the performance of their functions as Parliament may, by law, confer on them. The recommendations of the Finance Commission are implemented in the following way. The recommendations relating to distribution of union taxes and duties and grants in aid fall in this category and are to be implemented by an order of the President. The recommendations in respect of sharing of profit petroleum, debt relief, mode of central assistance, etc., are to be implemented by executive orders. Now we will discuss the features of the Finance Commission. The Finance Commission Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1951 was passed with the objective of giving a structured format to the Finance Commission of India and to bring it at par with world standards. It lays down rules regarding qualification and disqualification of members of the Commission, their appointment, term, eligibility, and powers. Qualifications of the members. The chairman of the Finance Commission is selected among people who have had experience in public affairs. The other four members are selected from people who are or have been or are qualified as judges of High Court, or have the knowledge of government finances or accounts, or have had experience in administration and financial expertise, or have special knowledge of economics. A member can be disqualified from being a member of the Commission. It can happen if he is mentally unsound, he is an undischarged insolvent, he has been convicted of an immoral offense, his financial and other interests are such that it hinders the smooth functioning of the Commission. Terms of office of members and eligibility for reappointment. Every member will be in office for the time period specified in the order of the President, but is eligible for reappointment provided he has, by means of a letter addressed to the President, resigned his office. Salaries and allowances of the members. The members of the Commission shall provide full-time or part-time service to the Commission as the President specifies in his order. The members shall be paid salaries and allowances as per the provisions made by the central government. Now we will try to analyze the working of the Finance Commission of India. The 11th Finance Commission of India. The 11th Finance Commission was appointed by the President on 3rd July 1998 for the period 2000 to 2005. It was chaired by Professor A. M. Khusro, and its members were Shri N. C. Jain, Shri J. C. Jaitley, Dr. Amaresh Bagchi, and Shri T. N. Srivastava. Terms of reference. The Commission was required to make recommendations to the President with regard to the following. First, with regard to Chapter 1 of Part 12 of the Constitution, the distribution between the center and the states of the net proceeds of taxes and the allocation between the states of the shares of these proceeds. Second, the principles governing the grants in aid of the revenues of the states out of the Consolidated Fund of India, and with regard to Article 275, the sums to be paid to the states which are in need of assistance by way of grants in aid of their revenues for purposes other than those specified in the provisos to Clause 1 of that article. Third, with regard to the recommendations made by the Finance Commission of the state, the measures needed to augment the consolidated fund of a state to supplement the resources of the panchayats and municipalities in the state. Fourth, suggestions for a restructuring of the public finances so as to restore budgetary balance and maintain macroeconomic stability.
Let us now discuss the major recommendations of 11th Finance Commission. First, the total share of the states in the net proceeds of the central taxes and duties would be 29.5% for the next 5 years. With regard to the revenue deficit grants to the states, a lump sum amount of 110 billion in the central budget, that is 2000 and 2001, was to be allocated. With regard to grants for the 5 years commencing from 1st of April 2000, to be given for upgradation of standards of administration and specific grants to certain states for special problems such as 100 billion for local bodies to be directed for maintenance of civic services, whereas rupees 16 billion per annum is for rural local bodies and rupees 4 billion per annum is for urban local bodies. With reference to grants and aid under Article 275, subclause 1 of the Constitution, which amounts to a total of 353.59 billion for the period 2000-2005, was to be provided to 15 states which will have deficit non-plan revenue account even after devolution of central tax revenues equal to the amount of deficits assessed during the period 2000-2005.
The 12th Finance Commission was appointed on 1st November 2002 to make recommendations on the distribution of net proceeds of shareable taxes between Union and states. The commission was headed by veteran economist of India, Mr. C. Rangarajan. The commission submitted its report on 30th November 2004 and covered the period from 2005 to 2010. The commission was required to make recommendations to the President with regard to the following. 1. The distribution of net proceeds of taxes between Union and states, which are to be divided under Chapter 1, Part 12 of the Constitution. The policies required to increase the consolidated fund of states on the basis of recommendations made by the Finance Commission of States to supplement the resources of municipalities and panchayats in the state. In making the recommendation, the Commission shall have its regard, among other considerations, to the resources of the Union Government and State Government for 5 years, starting from 1st April 2005, on the basis of the total tax and non-tax that it was likely to receive by the end of 2003 to 2004. The demand of the resources by the central government, in particular the need of expenditure on civil administration, internal security, defense, and other committed expenditure and liabilities.
Now we will discuss the major recommendation of the 12th Finance Commission. For macroeconomic stability, the total fiscal deficit for center and the states was to be reduced to 3% of the GDP, and the total tax GDP ratio of both the center and the states was to be increased to 17.6% of the GDP in 2009-10. The revenue deficit for the center and the states combined was to be reduced to zero by 2008. Interest payments relative to revenue receipts were to be brought down to 28% and 15% in the case of center and the states respectively. States were to follow a recruitment policy in a manner so that the total salary bill relative to revenue expenditure net of interest payment did not exceed 35%. The system of lending was to be brought to an end. The long-term goal should be to bring down the debt GDP ratio to 28% each for the center and the states. For distribution of union tax, the total share of the states in the total shareable central taxes was to be fixed at 30.5%, and the share of the states was to come down to 29.5% if the states levied tax on sugar, textiles and tobacco. The indicative amount of overall transfers to states was to be fixed at 38% of the centre's gross revenues receipts. For grants to local bodies, the total grant that will have to be given to the states for Panchayati Raj institutions and local urban bodies for the period 2005 to 9 was to be rupees 200 billion and rupees 50 billion respectively. The Calamity Relief Fund scheme was to continue as it was in the previous plans, with the central and states contributing in the ratio of 75 to 25. The size of the fund to be rupees 230.33 billion for the period 2005 and 10. Central government not to act as an intermediary for future lending to states, except in the case of weak states which are unable to raise funds from the market. In case of grants and aid to the states for the period 2005-10, the total non-planned revenue deficit grant of rupees 568.56 billion was recommended to 15 states, and the total grant of 101.72 billion was recommended for 8 educationally backward states. A grant of rupees 150 billion was recommended for building roads and bridges, which was in addition to the normal expenditure of the states, while the grants that is recommended to the states for maintenance of public buildings, forest, heritage, conversion and specific needs of the states was rupees 5 billion, rupees 1 billion, rupees 6.25 billion and rupees 71 billion respectively.
The 13th Finance Commission of India. The government on February 25, 2010 presented the 13th Finance Commission's report 2010-15 in the Parliament. The 13th Finance Commission, under the chairmanship of Mr. Vijay Kelkar, submitted its report to the President on December 30, 2009. The Commission is required to make recommendations to the President with regard to the following. First, review the state of finances of the Union and the states, keeping in view the operation of the States Debt Consolidation and Relief Facility 2005 to 2010 DCRF, and suggest measures for maintaining a stable and sustainable fiscal environment consistent with equitable growth. Second, review the present arrangements as regards financing of disaster management with reference to the National Calamity Contingency Fund and the Calamity Relief Fund and the funds envisaged in the Disaster Management Act 2005. Third, assess the resources of the center and the state for the 5-year period, taxation efforts and the potential of additional revenue mobilization, demands on the resources of the central government, the requirement of states to meet the non-salary component of maintenance expenditure on capital assets and plan schemes, with the objective of not only balancing receipts and expenditure but also generating surpluses. Fourth, analyze the need to ensure commercial viability of irrigation and power projects, departmental undertakings, and public sector enterprises through various means, including levy of user charges and the adoption of measures to promote efficiency. Fifth, take into consideration the likely impact of the proposed implementation of Goods and Services Act (GST) with effect from 1st April 2010, including its impact on foreign trade. Sixth, consider the need to improve the quality of public expenditure to obtain better outputs and outcomes, along with the need to manage ecology, environment, and climate change consistent with sustainable development.
Major recommendation of the 13th Finance Commission. The share of the states in the net proceeds of the shareable central taxes should be 32%. This is 1.5% higher than the recommendations of the 12th Finance Commission. Revenue deficit is to be progressively reduced and eliminated, followed by revenue surplus by 2013-14. Revenue accruing to a state is to be protected to the levels that would have accrued to it had service tax been a part of shareable central taxes, if the 88th Amendment to the Constitution is notified and followed up by a legislation enabling states to levy service tax. Fiscal deficit is to be reduced to 3% of the GDP by 2014-15. A target of 68% of the GDP for the combined debt of center and state is to be set. The National Calamity contingency fund should be merged with the National Disaster Fund and the Calamity Relief Fund with the state disaster response funds of the respective states. Commission has suggested a roadmap for the introduction of a single rate goods and services tax. Under GST, a single rate or goods and services tax is proposed. To make GST purely consumption based, taxes and cesses should be subsumed. Petrol, diesel, alcohol, tobacco may be charged to GST with additional levies by the centre and the states. Only public services, unprocessed food items, health, education, and transactions between employer and the employee are to be exempted.
The 14th Finance Commission of India. The 14th Finance Commission has been set up under the chairmanship of Dr. Y. V. Reddy, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India. The 14th Finance Commission is required to give its report by 31st October 2014. Its recommendations will cover the 5-year period commencing from 1st April 2015. Terms of reference of 14th Finance Commission of India. The Commission is required to make recommendations to the President with regard to the following. As the states are subjected to more and more interstate migrant workers and illegal migrants from the neighboring countries, the Finance Commission shall give appropriate weightage in distribution of the total taxes to the states based on these criteria. The states which are giving more employment to interstate workers are ahead in demographic transition. The states with coastline shall be given appropriate share from the royalty or taxes collected by the central government from the minerals produced, including oil and natural gas, from the area of territorial waters and exclusive economic zone, similar to land-based minerals production.
Apart from its recommendations on the sharing the tax proceeds between the centre and the states, which will apply for a 5-year period beginning April 1, 2015, the Commission has been asked to suggest on pricing of public utilities such as electricity and water in an independent manner, and also to look into issues like disinvestment, GST compensation, sale of non-priority public sector undertakings and subsidies. Measures for maintaining a stable and sustainable fiscal environment consistent with equitable growth, including suggestions to amend the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Acts. With regard to debt-stressed states, the Commission has been asked to suggest steps for augmenting revenue of states which are lagging. Review the present arrangements as regards financing of disaster management with reference to the funds constituted under the Disaster Management Act 2005 and make appropriate recommendations thereon. Estimate the quantum of subsidies needed to keep growth both sustainable and inclusive. Insulate pricing of power, irrigation, drinking water, and public transport from politics. Make public sector enterprises competitive and market oriented. Consider disinvestment prospects and exit non-priority enterprises. Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. The Finance Commission defines the financial relations between the Union and the states and deals with devolution of non-planned resources. It aims at redressing the vertical imbalances between the taxation powers and expenditure responsibilities of the centre and the states respectively, and the equalization of all public services across the states. Despite the changing fiscal environment and considerable expansion in its function, the institution of Finance Commission has ensured smooth functioning of centre-state fiscal relations. Fiscal federalism will always remain a work in progress, and the institution of the Finance Commission, as in the past, will continue to deal with the changing environment and emerging challenges for fiscal restructuring.